Hi, my name is Helen Garcia, and you're listening to the podcast Yellow Chair Collective with the Therapist mini-series. Today, I'm talking to Lily Tran. She's an associate clinical social worker. Lily, how are you?
All right. How are you doing, Helen?
I'm doing really well. Well, today I have a series of 5 questions for you to ask and answer. And the purpose of this is just so people can get to know you and your clinical style. But the first question is a little bit hard. What is your view on mental health?
I think mental health is incredibly important. I think it's as important as physical health, but oftentimes society values physical health greater than mental health. I think people often conflate physical rest with mental rest. And I think it's very vital that we take care of our mental health as much as we take care of our physical health. That means prioritizing things we enjoy doing, things that feel restful rather than just physically sleeping. I think sleep is really important, but it's also important that we make time to do activities that make us feel rested and not only rely on sleep to help us feel emotionally rested as well.
I really like that perspective. Like physical health is as equal, if not more, on the same platform as mental health. And we often conflate that as lesser than. Can you say more about how that informs your work as a therapist when you're treating
Yeah,
someone? Yeah.
of course. Yeah. So I think it's really important that we value physical health and mental health on the same playing field. I like to use the example or metaphor rather that because I ask my clients to imagine they're running a marathon, right? And with a physical marathon, right? Eventually your knees will give out. You can't run forever, right? And you have to take breaks. You have to take, moments of rest. You can't just run infinitely, right? It's the same way with mental health, right? If we keep doing these tasks without taking time for ourselves, right, to emotionally rest or take care of ourselves, do things we enjoy and feel emotionally rested as much as we feel physically rested, then we are going to burn out emotionally, right? So a lot of the things that I work on with clients is identifying how you emotionally rest, not just how you physically rest. What are things you enjoy? What are things you do to make yourself feel emotionally rested? Whether that is hanging out with other people for some people, right? Extroverted people, or it's, sometimes it's reading a book, sometimes it's playing games, sometimes it's taking yourself out on like a solo date, right? But it's about doing things that you personally enjoy to make yourself feel more emotionally rested, not just physically rested, so that you have the energy to do the things you need to do as well.
Yeah. How does emotional rest impact the way that we function in our body?
Right. So if you don't emotionally rest, just like your knees might give out in a physical marathon, you will feel burnt out, right? For some people, that manifests as executive functioning concerns, right? Like they really want to do a task, right? But their body does not let them do that task. They're physically unable to, right? And that is sometimes how emotional burnout kind of manifests, right? Sometimes it manifests in, pockets of doom scrolling, right? Well, they're where they will like pull out their phone, right? And they'll start doom scrolling to just kind of get past that like emotional hump where they feel crashed, right? But they're unable to do something about it.
Mhm.
A lot of the time, burnout shows up in many ways, right? And with physical health, it's easy to see when you fall to your knees and you're unable to get up, right? With emotional exhaustion, it's a lot harder to tell because we often are told to kind of just push through or like, just just push through basically, right? By
Mhm.
society, by other people, just to get up, even if you feel exhausted, right? But the reality is that it's a lot harder to do that in practice. And at times people can feel like helpless or cornered, right? When they feel emotionally exhausted or they feel these emotionally burnout, right? Because they're forced to do these tasks or be productive, but their body isn't letting them do that. So they become kind of shells of themselves. And that becomes very, very hard. It can feel like very similar to like depressive symptoms, right? Where you feel like you have no emotional energy to go forward or to do the tasks that you need to do. And that can lead to impacts in your relationships with other people, right? Because you might find yourself unable to, hold your own in these like public conversations with other people.
Mm.
It might make you feel like you have no energy to interact with people the way you used to, right?
Mm.
And a lot of that is due to not taking care of yourself, not prioritizing yourself the way you do other people.
I'm going to go off track here and just double
Yeah.
click on what you said, because I think that's really important for people to know that we live in a society right now where work from home is a lot more common. And the distinction between work and personal has almost become really blurred. And so for people that are interested in doing mental health work and don't know where to start, like what does that work even look like to start to get out of burnout or perhaps gain a clearer mindset when it comes to those things?
A lot of the time, I ask people who are in emotional burnout, like, what makes you feel rested? And a lot of the
Mm,
time, they might not even know, right? They might not have the answers for me, right? And then when that happens, we look at like, when is the last time you felt rested?
mm,
And then we explore the situation or the environment around those circumstances, right? So it could be looking at like, maybe the last time you felt rested was when you went on a trip with your family, right? What about that trip made you feel rested? Was it hanging out with your family? Was it walking outside and taking a nature hike? Was it, the fact that you didn't have work to do so you could stay at home for, brief amounts of time to, check in with yourself, read a book that you haven't read in a while, right?
mhm,
And then it's about looking at those things, and identifying what makes you feel rested so that we could do that more, right? And we can kind of make time or space, whether that it might start with, 2 times a week. It might start with 1 time a week. It might start with once a day, right? It depends on the person. But when we make time to do things for ourselves, to feel emotionally rested, to prioritize ourselves, then we find time to regain our energy so that we could do the things we want to do.
Yeah, it's almost as if we've lost track of what it means to be in a place of rest emotionally. We see that in like outside circumstances, but what you're talking about is the feeling of rest
hmm
when it comes to mental health care. But for people who are looking for a client therapist relationship, how would you help a new client who might be going through some of these struggles?
Right. So basically, a lot of it will be kind of tapping into their experiences, right? What are you
Mm,
experiencing right now? What kind of emotions are you experiencing right now? What is it like to live a day to day for you, right? It could be like it could start with maybe their general recollection of what a day looks like, but then it will go into like, like tell me what emotionally that feels like, right?
mm,
I could ask questions directly like that. Or we could talk about, like, for example, it sounds like you're dealing with a lot. And then they'll go into more about how that is, right?
mhm,
And then they might touch on like events that have happened in their life recently, right? And then we'll go
mhm,
into how their reactions, how they felt in those situations, right? We talk a lot about like when it comes to productivity, we talk about control, right? What can you control? What can you not control, right?
mm.
And oftentimes people take on more burden than they are able to handle. And that leads to more emotional burnout. So sometimes it starts with what can you control in this situation? And how can you lessen the burden on yourself? What ways can you rest? What ways can you find time to do things for yourself? Right.
Mm,
And when it comes to situations where you don't have control, right?
mhm.
Like, how can you prioritize yourself in those situations or navigate those situations from the lens of what you can control?
That's interesting because when I talk to clients, oftentimes they have such a split view on life. I either choose myself or I choose other people. How do you help a client incorporate the and in their experience?
Yeah, of course. So the reality is that I like to break down this kind of black and white thinking as either you have to do one thing or you have to do the other, right? The
Right.
reality is that life is often not as black and white as people think it is, right? And in order to
Mhm.
help other people, you have to help yourself first. And the reality is that I like to use like the airplane example, right? Like they tell you to put on your mask before you put on somebody else's, right? If you can't
Mm,
put on your own mask, then you won't be able to help other people or you'll burn out before you can help as many people as you could, right? If
mm,
you really care about other people and you want to be the best version of yourself for other people, you have to be the best version for yourself first.
mm,
And when you take care of yourself, you have more energy capacity to help other people or to take care of other people. To take care of other people isn't to be around because people, see and notice the energy that you give off too, right?
mm,
But also, when you understand yourself, you can understand other people better, right? Because you're going to be able to connect with that empathy within yourself to kind of facilitate other people understanding you too. It
mm.
becomes this kind of push pull dynamic where, when you understand yourself better, when you do things for yourself, when you prioritize yourself, you have more capacity to do things for other people, to understand other people, and to connect with other people.
I really like your approach to open-ended questions. I think that that's something that I am still getting better at, but I really appreciate how you take the time to assess how the client is doing from a really open place. Like, how are you doing emotionally? What's your experience been like? It's refreshing because it has me thinking of like, oh yeah, what is my emotional rest? Like, how do I get to that place, right? I think that's a very gentle and open nature approach. Like, it kind of makes me think of like earthy, grounded tones. When people look for a therapist, oftentimes they're looking for problems that need to be solved. But as a therapist, I think you and I both know that there's more to that than meets
Hmm.
the eye. Like, what advice would you give to someone who is looking for a therapist? What are things that they should ask, things that they should watch out for, blind spots that they might not know they have when looking for
Yeah,
a therapist?
definitely. So I think it's really a matter of finding somebody you feel safe with, whether
Mm,
that is me or you or someone else, right? But find
mhm,
someone that you can feel truly comfortable with, because at the end of the day, you could meet, the objectively, best therapist with the most clients or who have quote unquote helped the most people, right? But the reality is if you don't connect with them, if you aren't able to be vulnerable with them or tell them the things that, you are holding deep inside, right? Then the therapy won't be effective, right?
mm,
It's a lot about, I also kind of like to approach this in, this idea of change in a different way too, in the sense that like people don't change other people, they change themselves, right?
mm,
So therapy isn't necessarily about like, I'm not here to, tell you XYZ is going to fix your problem, right?
yeah.
It's about like sitting with a client. Where are you now? Right? What is leading you to experience the things you're experiencing? And how do we heal that deep inner wound that is leading you to feel stuck? Right? Because a lot of the time people want to make changes. They want to, receive the help that, they so desire when they seek a therapist, right? But there's something stopping them, whether that is a deep, inner wound or,
Mhm,
you know, not having the tools, right? And a lot of the time it's about understanding where those feelings come from and helping them navigate or understand themselves in order to find or build the tools to handle crisis or manage things on their own. And I think
mm,
a lot of that kind of shifted mindset is going to be important when you look for a therapist, right? Because at the end of the day, you want somebody that you can feel vulnerable with, that you can be open with. You want somebody that you can share these things to, that you can navigate things with, right?
mm,
And that will give you the tools that you need, right? But also keeping in mind that this person is not going to just like, you're not going to go to therapy and then leave like all your problems are fixed forever, right? Ideally, therapy is a place where you can heal those emotional wounds, those deep rooted and seated beliefs about yourself, right? To improve the way that you think about yourself and your view of the world so that eventually when you handle crises or when you experience these things, you can handle them on your own and you can stand on your own rather
mm.
than, feeling so stuck or overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's something that I often hear as feedback on the other side as a therapist that on paper we might be a good fit, but there does need to be this trust and opening that happens between the therapist and the client. And I loved what you said about the insight blocking what they might want. And oftentimes it's the removal of those obstacles, right? I'm reading this book. It's my like second or third time reading it, called The Gift of Therapy by Irvin Yalom. Have you heard of it?
I
It's
have,
famous.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it myself.
It's really good, but it's one of my favorite books on therapy. And the third chapter is talking about how oftentimes people who go into therapy think that the therapist's job is to help them get to their destination, but the therapist's job is actually to identify the very obstacles that get them to their destination, right? Like you
Hmm.
might be driving, this is like a proverbial analogy. You might be driving a 1982 Cadillac and you want to drive all the way to Wisconsin and you're living in Los Angeles. Well, the very obstacle is the Cadillac, the vehicle that you're driving in. And as a guide, you have to get the client to see that they might be trying to make that Cadillac work, but that's the very obstacle that's keeping them from where they want to go, right? And I loved what you talked about of you might want to build a healthier relationship with your body, but you might be surrounded by friends who constantly comment on how fat they are, how not skinny enough they are, how not blank enough they are,
Yeah.
right? And our job as a therapist is to kind of have those really hard conversations of, I notice that these sort of things are getting in your way. What do you think about that? Our
Yeah.
job isn't to remove the obstacle, but to help the client identify said obstacle so that they can remove it themselves, right?
Yeah.
Which is hard for what we do. So when it comes to the honesty that you have to approach those types of conversations, how do you go about that?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the time we look at rather than the event itself or what I feel about the event or the
Mhm.
countertransference that I might experience based on what they're telling me, right? I focus on how does that affect you, right? When they say these
Mm,
things, how do you feel about it, right? Because it
mhm,
seems like you're bringing this up, right? Very
mhm,
upset, right? Very
mhm,
frustrated, very sad, even, right?
mhm,
And allow yourself to feel and experience those emotions, right? How are you, reacting when they call you fat, right? What does that remind you of, right? What kind of things do you say to yourself, when you're alone, right?
mm,
Does this remind you of a time in childhood when your parents might have called you that, or when you had a childhood friend that might have done that same thing, right? And it feels like this is a narrative in your life where you encounter people who criticize you or make comments about you. And it seems like you're, holding that narrative for yourself, right? It influences the way you talk about yourself, the way you see yourself, right? But the things we learn can be unlearned. The things that,
mm,
you hear from other people are not your own voice. Those are the voices of people who criticize you or hurt you, right?
mm,
So how do we fight back against those narratives, right? When
mm,
you hear that, all these things about your body or who you are, like, what can you say in response to those things, right? And it starts with
mm.
you, then it can lead to how you interact with other people in your life too, right?
Yeah, yeah. Have you watched that show Shrinking on Apple TV?
I have heard of it. I've not watched it.
Yeah, but it's basically a show with Harrison Ford and Jason Segel, and he makes a lot of unethical decisions that I would never make as a therapist, where he tells people what to do, right? And he becomes involved in their life. I like how you're approaching it because it's very ethical and it's also giving clients choice, right? You're telling them, what do you think about it? How do you process this? And what do you want to do about these obstacles that you're identifying with me in the session? Which, I think in references. So I really appreciate your wisdom when it comes to those things. But Lily, who do you like to work with and why do you like to work with them?
Yeah, so I myself am neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with ADHD in my 20s. But
How old?
I was specifically, it was my first year of graduate school, actually.
Cool.
I had just turned 22. But at that point, like, I had always kind of known I was different throughout my life. I had experienced rejection sensitivity dysphoria, but I didn't have a name for it. And I spent a lot of my younger years knowing that there was something different about me, I guess, without lack of a better term. But
Mm,
I didn't really have like the tools or the environment or the support system that I needed to navigate through that. So it developed into a lot of like, I think, shame and guilt. And
mm,
so I think all of that to say, I love working with the neurodivergent population because I understand that experience of
mm,
like growing up being kind of invalidated, having all that shame and guilt kind of fester in you for a really long time, like not being who they want you to be, not being who society wants you to be, not being who your parents or your family might want you to be, right? And being told that you're too sensitive or that you're reacting to things in a not normal way, right? And I I felt that shame for a really long time until I think it was a very recent kind of history where, I reconnected with one of my best friends in from elementary school, right? And, she's the best friend I could have ever asked for, but she made me really feel seen in a lot of ways. And I learned a lot
mm,
from her.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah. That's beautiful. That helps me understand the messaging you have around kindness around yourself when it comes to emotional rest. This has been really fun. Thanks, Lily. I appreciate you. Yeah. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Okay.